The gold ring on her finger burned into my vision, my wife's ring, the one I'd left on the nightstand that morning. Mia Sterling, my star student, smirked as she twisted it, daring me to react. My wife's spare key fob was in my pocket, dropped by the masked man who'd just ambushed me in the alley. Someone had been inside my home for weeks, and now they were inside my life. Too late, I realized. She wasn't just a student. She was already there before I even knew the game had started. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low, predatory vibration against the silence of the lecture hall as Thomas Miller traced the curve of the chalkboard. He turned, chalk dust coating his fingertips like powdered bone, and caught a glint of gold in the third row. Mia Sterling propped her chin on her palm, her fingers splayed against her cheek. There, encircling her ring finger, sat Sarah's wedding band. The hand-hammered yellow gold and the distinctive sapphire chip Thomas had commissioned himself in a small shop in downtown New Haven. The air in the room thickened, smelling of stale coffee and floor wax. Thomas's voice caught. The sentence regarding Cantillon imperatives died in his throat. Mia didn't look away. Instead, she tapped the ring against her jawline, a rhythmic, metallic clicking that echoed through the tiered seating. She offered a thin, practiced smile, a predator's curve that suggested she'd spent the morning in his bedroom, touching his linens, breathing his private air. Thomas gripped the edge of the mahogany podium until the wood bit into his palms. His pulse thrummed in his ears, drowning out the scratching of pens. He forced his lungs to expand, though the oxygen tasted thin. Mia shifted, adjusting her sleeve to ensure the sunlight hit the gold directly. He knew that ring. He knew the weight of it. He had left it on the marble vanities of their master bathroom at 6:15 that morning because Sarah had complained her fingers were swelling in the humid Connecticut heat. To see it here, on the hand of a 22-year-old student who had no business knowing the layout of his home, felt like a physical violation, as if Mia had reached into his chest and squeezed. He stumbled through the final 5 minutes of the lecture, his logic crumbling into fragments. When the bell finally shrilled, a sharp, mechanical scream that vibrated in his teeth. The student surged toward the exit. Thomas remained motionless, watching Mia slide her notebook into her bag with agonizing deliberation. She rose, the ring flashing one last time as she smoothed her skirt, and waited for him to bridge the distance. "Mia," Thomas said, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over pavement. He stepped down from the dais, counting the steps in his mind, 1, 2, 3, until he reached the floor of the hall. He kept his hands at his sides, though they were shaking. "We need to discuss the accessory you're wearing." Mia tilted her head, her wide, innocent eyes reflecting the harsh overhead glow. "Oh, this?" She lifted her hand, admiring the sapphire. "We think it's quite beautiful, Professor. It has such a history, doesn't it? A sense of belonging. We felt like it needed to be seen today." "That belongs to my wife," Thomas hissed, stepping closer. The smell of her perfume hit him, something cloyingly sweet, like rotting lilies. "I don't know how you got into my house, or why you think this is a game, but you will take it off and give it to me right now." Before Mia could respond, the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open with a resounding thud. Arthur Higgins marched down the aisle, his portly frame draped in expensive, scratchy tweed. He was already reaching for his tie, performing the three-point adjustment, left, right, center, that signaled he was in public relations mode. "Thomas, there you are," Arthur boomed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. He placed a heavy, paternal hand on Mia's shoulder, a gesture that made Thomas's stomach churn. "I was just telling the dean about our star pupil here." Mia's latest essay on the ethics of digital privacy is nothing short of revolutionary. A real credit to your mentorship, Thomas. Thomas felt the air leave the room. He looked from Arthur's beaming, oblivious face to Mia's mask of studious humility. She looked like a different person under Arthur's gaze, the perfect student, the bright future of the department. Arthur, I was actually just having a private word with Miss Sterling about a personal matter, Thomas said, trying to keep the desperation out of his tone. Personal? Nonsense. Arthur laughed, a loud, hollow sound. Save the shop talk for the office. Mia, I've invited the board to hear your thesis summary at the gala tonight. Thomas, you'll be there to introduce her, of course. It's a big night for the department. We need our best faces forward. Mia smiled, her eyes never leaving Thomas's. We wouldn't miss it for the world, Dean Higgins. Professor Miller has been so instrumental in my development. Arthur clapped Thomas on the back, the force of it nearly knocking his glasses down his nose. That's the spirit. Now come along, Mia. I want to show you the seating chart. As they walked away, Thomas watched the gold ring disappear into the shadows of the hallway. He stood alone in the empty lecture hall, the silence pressing in on him. He needed to move. He needed to get home, to check on Sarah, to see if anything else was missing. He gathered his leather briefcase, the strap cold and slick in his sweaty palm, and headed for the side exit that led to the faculty parking lot. He turned into a narrow stone walkway, a dark alcove between the library and the main hall. The smell of wet limestone and old mildew was thick here. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the wall. Before Thomas could react, a heavy weight slammed into his chest, pinning him against the rough brick. A masked figure, wearing a blue varsity jacket that smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap detergent, shoved a forearm against Thomas's throat. The man's face was obscured by a dark knit cap pulled low. "Keep your mouth shut, Professor," the man growled. The voice was young, rough, and vibrating with a nervous energy. "You start talking about things that don't concern you, and things get messy. You understand? Stay away from Mia." Adrenaline, sharp and metallic, flooded Thomas's system. He wasn't a fighter, but he was a man who lived by the count. He felt the weight of his briefcase in his right hand. He swung it with a grunt of exertion, the heavy corner of the leather-bound frame catching the attacker in the ribs with a sickening thud. The man gasped, his grip loosening. Thomas shoved him back, his boots skidding on the damp pavement. "Who are you?" Thomas shouted, his voice cracking. The attacker didn't stay to answer. He scrambled backward, tripping over a loose stone before disappearing into the fog that was beginning to roll across the campus quad. Thomas stood panting, his heart a frantic bird against his ribs. He looked down and saw something glinting on the ground where the struggle had occurred. He knelt, his knees cracking, 1, 2, and picked up a black plastic key fob. His thumb brushed over a small, jagged scratch on the side, a mark he recognized instantly. It was the spare key to his SUV. Sarah had lost it a month ago at a grocery store in Greenwich. She had been so upset, crying about her pregnancy brain, making her forgetful. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The attacker hadn't just been a random thug. He was carrying the keys to Thomas's life. Mia hadn't just stolen a ring. She had been systematically collecting the pieces of his household, perhaps for weeks. He wasn't being stalked. He was being replaced. He practically ran to his office, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He needed a sanctuary, a place where the rules still applied. He swiped his ID card at the door, the electronic lock clicking open with a sound like a snapping bone. But as he stepped inside, the smell hit him first. Lilies. The room was cloyingly thick with the scent of white lilies. Sarah's favorite, the ones he bought her every anniversary. A massive bouquet sat in the center of his desk, the white petals looking like wax in the dim light. Next to them was a small, square card. He opened it with trembling fingers. From both of us, it read in a neat, slanted handwriting that looked terrifyingly like Sarah's. Thomas looked around his office, his eyes darting from one object to the next. His research files, years of work on ethical frameworks and moral philosophy, had been pulled from their shelves. They weren't just scattered. They were rearranged. His books were now sorted by color rather than subject, a rainbow of spines that made his stomach turn. He sank into his office chair, but immediately bolted upright. The seat was warm. The fabric held the lingering heat of a body that had just been sitting there, watching the door, waiting for him. On the corner of his desk, the framed photo of Sarah, the one taken on their honeymoon in Maine, had been turned face down. He reached out to flip it over, but his hand stopped. He couldn't touch it. The integrity of the room was gone. The grid he used to navigate his life had been warped. He felt a sudden, desperate need to see the security footage from the lecture hall. If he could just prove she had the ring, if he could show Arthur the physical evidence, the nightmare would have to end. He bypassed the elevator and took the stairs to the basement server room, counting every step, 1, 2, 3, 22. The parking garage was adjacent, a vast cavern of raw concrete and flickering sodium lights. He walked toward his car, his footsteps echoing like hammer strikes. "Professor Miller," the voice came from behind a concrete pillar. Thomas froze. He recognized that slouch, the heavy brow, the grease-stained cuticles. It was Kevin Brooks, the quiet kid from the IT department who always smelled of hand sanitizer. He was wearing the same blue varsity jacket Thomas had seen in the alcove. Kevin stepped into the yellow light, a tire iron dangling from his hand. The metal scraped against the concrete with a sound that set Thomas's teeth on edge. "You really don't know when to stop, do you?" Kevin said, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Mia said you'd be difficult. She said you liked your little boxes too much." "Kevin, put that down," Thomas said, his voice surprisingly steady. "You're a student. You have a future. Don't throw it away for her." "She's the only one who sees us," Kevin muttered. He lunged, the tire iron whistling through the air. Thomas dove to the side, his shoulder hitting the cold concrete. He scrambled toward his SUV, fumbling with the key fob he'd recovered. The lights flashed, a beacon of safety. He yanked the door open and slid inside just as the tire iron smashed into the window glass. The safety glass didn't shatter, but it spiderwebbed into 1,000 white veins. Thomas didn't think. He slammed the car into reverse. Kevin was caught between the open door and a concrete pillar. The metal of the door groaned as it pinned the boy's arm, a sickening crunch echoing through the garage. Kevin screamed, a high, thin sound, and dropped the tire iron. Thomas shifted into drive and floored it, the tires shrieking against the epoxy floor. In the rearview mirror, he saw Kevin slumped against the pillar, clutching his arm, his face a mask of agony and betrayal. Thomas didn't stop. He drove out of the garage, the cold wind whistling through the cracked window, his mind racing. He couldn't go to the police. Not yet. Kevin was a student, and Thomas had just crushed his arm with a 2-ton vehicle. It would look like an assault. And Mia was the university's darling. He needed to be smart. He needed to be the man of logic he claimed to be. He drove to the campus security office, a small brick building near the main gate. He marched inside, his coat torn, his glasses askew. "I need to report a theft and an assault," Thomas told the officer behind the desk, a man named Miller, who had always been friendly. "A student, Mia Sterling, stole my wife's wedding ring, and Kevin Brooks just attacked me in the garage." The officer looked at him, but there was no friendliness in his eyes. He looked at Thomas with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Professor Miller, we were actually just about to call you. Why don't you have a seat?" "I don't want a seat. I want to see the footage from the lecture hall," Thomas demanded. The officer turned a computer monitor around. "We checked the footage, Professor, after we received an anonymous tip about your conduct." Thomas leaned in. The video showed the lecture hall from earlier that morning. There he was, standing at the podium, and there was Mia in the third row. But as the camera zoomed in on her hand, Thomas felt the world tilt. Her fingers were bare. There was no gold ring, no sapphire. "That's impossible," Thomas whispered. "I saw it. She was clicking it against her teeth." "There's more," the officer said, his voice cold. He clicked a file labeled Correspondence. The screen filled with emails, dozens of them. They were sent from Thomas's university account to Mia Sterling. The language was graphic, obsessive, and deeply inappropriate. They detailed a torrid affair, a professor begging a student to stay with him, promising her grades and a scholarship in exchange for her silence about their secret life. "I never wrote those," Thomas said, his voice barely audible. "The digital signature is yours, Professor, sent from your office computer late at night over the last 3 months," the officer said. "And then there's this." He played an audio file. It was Thomas's voice, clear as a bell. "I can't lose you, Mia. If Sarah finds out, my life is over. Just take the ring. It's a symbol, a promise." Thomas felt a cold prickle dance across his skin. It was his voice, but the words were a jigsaw puzzle of things he'd said in lectures, in private meetings, in phone calls, stitched together with such seamless precision that even he couldn't hear the seams. "Professor, the dean has been notified," the officer said, standing up. "Given your state of mind, we're not filing charges yet. But you need to leave the campus, now. We'll be in touch regarding your administrative leave." Thomas walked out into the cool evening air, the security by sentinel signs on the campus lawns mocking him with their perfect 45-degree angles. He had tried to use the system, to follow the protocol, and Mia had turned it into a cage. He was no longer the victim. He was the predator, the disgraced academic caught in a web of his own making. He drove home, the counting starting again as he pulled into his driveway. 1, 2, 3, 14. He stepped onto the porch, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. The house was quiet, the smell of fresh-cut grass from the neighbor's yard heavy in the air. He walked into the kitchen, expecting to find Sarah crying or the house in shambles. Instead, he found a domestic tableau that froze the blood in his veins. Sarah was standing at the butcher block island, laughing. She was wearing her favorite apron, the one with the flower stains on the hem. And next to her, wearing one of Sarah's old sweaters and meticulously dicing carrots, was Mia Sterling. "Thomas, you're home early," Sarah said, her face lighting up with that weary warmth he loved. "Look who stopped by to help with the gala prep. Mia said you were so overwhelmed with the scholarship committee that she wanted to take some of the load off." Mia looked up, her eyes wide and shimmering with a terrifying kindness. "We just wanted to make sure everything was perfect for tonight, Professor." Sarah was telling us all about your mother's grocery lists. It's such a beautiful tradition. Thomas looked at the counter. There, next to the carrots, was the handwritten list Sarah rewrote every Sunday. Mia's hand was resting inches away from it. "Sarah, can I speak to you in the garage for a moment?" Thomas asked, his voice tight. "Oh, Thomas, don't be grumpy," Sarah said, waving a hand. "Mia's been a godsend. She even found my wedding ring. It had rolled under the guest room dresser. Can you believe it?" Mia held up her hand. The gold ring was back on her finger, but she slid it off with a graceful movement and handed it to Sarah. "I'm just glad it's back where it belongs, Mrs. Miller." "I need to check the lawnmower," Thomas said, his mind fracturing. "Sarah, please, just a moment." He turned and walked into the garage, not waiting for an answer. He needed to get away from the smell of the carrots and the sound of Mia's "we." The garage was 10 degrees hotter than the house, the air thick with the smell of oil and old cardboard. A moment later, the door opened. But it wasn't Sarah. Mia stepped into the garage, closing the door behind her. The light from the single overhead bulb cast long, jagged shadows across the floor. She didn't look like a student anymore. She looked like a conqueror. "You're making a scene, Thomas," she whispered, her voice like silk over a blade. "And we don't like scenes. They're so unstructured." "Get out of my house," Thomas said, backing away toward the workbench. His hand brushed against the handle of the heavy gas-powered mower. "I know what you did at the security office. I know about Kevin." "Kevin is a loyal friend," Mia said, stepping closer. "He understands that sometimes the old structures have to be cleared away to make room for something new. Don't you like the way we dice the carrots, Thomas? Don't you like the way we fit into your life? You're insane," Thomas spat. Mia laughed, a soft, melodic sound that didn't reach her eyes. "We're more like you than you think. We like things in their place. And right now, you're in the wrong place." She lunged at him with a sudden, violent speed. Thomas ducked, but her fingernails raked across his cheek, drawing blood. He grabbed her wrists, the two of them stumbling back against the lawnmower. In the struggle, his foot kicked the starter cord. The engine roared to life, a deafening, mechanical scream that filled the small space. Mia fought with a feral intensity, her teeth bared. She tried to shove his head down toward the spinning blades of the mower, her strength surprising and unnatural. Thomas felt his heel slip on a patch of oil. He slammed his weight forward, pinning her against the wall of the garage. With a roar of desperation, he reached out and snatched the gold chain from around her neck, the one she had moved the ring to when she entered the house. He yanked it hard, the metal biting into her skin until the clasp snapped. He held the ring in his fist, his chest heaving. Mia slumped against the wall, her breathing ragged, a thin line of blood trickling from her neck where the chain had broken. "I have it," Thomas panted. "I have the proof. I'm calling the police, and I'm telling Sarah everything." Mia didn't look defeated. She slowly reached into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out her phone. She tapped the screen, and a recording began to play over the roar of the mower. "No, Thomas, please, stop it. You're hurting me." Mia's recorded voice shrieked. "I won't do it. I won't lie for you anymore. Please, let me go." Then, Thomas's own voice, distorted by the struggle. "You'll do what I say, or I'll ruin you. You think anyone will believe a girl like you?" The recording was a masterpiece of manipulation. It sounded like a violent assault in progress. It sounded like a man destroying a young woman's life in the dark of a garage. "If you call the police," Mia said, her voice calm and cold, "this goes to the dean, the local news, and Sarah's phone. in that order. Thomas felt his knees go weak. He reached out to steady himself against the workbench, the gold ring feeling like a burning coal in his palm. "What do you want?" he whispered. "The Excellence in Ethics Scholarship," Mia said, straightening her sweater. "Tonight, at the gala, you will stand at the podium, and you will tell the world that we are the future of this university. You will give us the money, the prestige, and the keys to the next kingdom. And if I do, then we might let you keep your little house for a while longer," Mia said, walking toward the door. She paused, her hand on the knob. "Oh, and Thomas?" 14 steps to the bedroom. We counted them ourselves. She slipped back into the kitchen, leaving Thomas alone with the roar of the mower and the weight of his own ruin. Subverted. Thomas stood in the vibrating heat of the garage, the smell of exhaust stinging his eyes. He looked at the ring in his hand. This was the logical moment to go to the police. But Mia had already poisoned that well. No, he had to be smarter. He had to use the one thing he still had: his reputation as a man of unimpeachable logic. He decided he would go to the gala. He would play her game, but he would build a trap within it. He spent the next hour in his home office, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He wasn't writing a speech, he was writing a confession, but not his own. He was creating a digital trail that linked the scholarship funds to a private account Mia had opened under a false name, a name he'd found on a scrap of paper in her backpack earlier. It was a brilliant plan. He would present the evidence of financial fraud during the introduction. It was clean, it was professional, and it was undeniable. By the time the police arrived, Mia would be the one in handcuffs for embezzlement, a far more academic crime that the university couldn't ignore. He felt a surge of confidence. He had outmaneuvered her. He smoothed his tie, left, right, center, and walked into the kitchen. Mia was there, helping Sarah into her coat. She looked at Thomas and smiled, a knowing, triumphant curve of her lips. Thomas returned the smile, his heart steady for the first time in days. "Ready to go, Professor?" she asked. "Quite ready," Thomas replied. The drive to the Founders' Gala was silent, save for the rhythmic clicking of the turn signal. Sarah sat between them, her hand resting on Thomas's knee. He felt a wave of relief. In 2 hours, this would be over. The nightmare would be purged by the cold light of a financial audit. They arrived at the grand ballroom, a sea of gold leaf and crimson silk. The sound of a violin quartet filled the air, playing a looping, upbeat melody. Arthur Higgins was there, adjusting his tie 3 times as he greeted the donors. "Thomas, you look rejuvenated," Arthur boomed. And Mia, simply stunning. Mia was wearing a dress that made Thomas's breath hitch. It was a deep, shimmering silk, the exact shade of crimson that Sarah was wearing. Standing next to each other, they looked like a before and after photograph. A twisted mirror image. Thomas excused himself, heading for the tech booth behind the podium. He had the thumb drive in his pocket. He would hand it to the technician, tell him it was the presentation slides, and then the trap would spring. He reached the booth and handed the drive to the young man sitting behind the monitors. "Everything's on there," Thomas said, his voice firm. "Just play it when I give the signal." The technician nodded, sliding the drive into the port. "You got it, Professor. We've already got the intro slides queued up from your assistant." Thomas froze. "My assistant?" "Yeah, the girl, Mia. She came by 20 minutes ago. Said you wanted to add a few last-minute personal touches to the presentation." A cold prickle of unease danced across Thomas's skin. He looked toward the podium. Mia was standing near the front row, talking to Robert Taylor, the head of the board. She looked back at Thomas and winked. The crack appeared in the form of a small icon on the technician's screen. It wasn't the folder for the financial audit. It was a file labeled The Miller Legacy, a private history. Thomas lunged for the mouse. "Wait, don't open that." "Too late, Professor. It's already in the autoplay sequence for the keynote," the technician said, frowning. "Is there a problem?" The screen above the podium flared to life. But it wasn't a spreadsheet of embezzled funds. It was a video of Thomas's own house. The camera moved through the rooms with a slow, voyeuristic intimacy. It showed his sock drawer, perfectly aligned. It showed Sarah's mother's grocery lists. And then it showed the master bedroom. The audio kicked in, a high-definition recording of Thomas and Sarah's private conversations. Not edited fragments, but hours of them. Thomas complaining about the suffocating nature of Sarah's grief. Sarah crying about how Thomas treated her like a variable in an equation. The ballroom went dead silent. Hundreds of donors, the board, the dean, all of them watched as the most private, shameful moments of Thomas's marriage were broadcast in 40-foot-high resolution, but the catastrophic reveal was yet to come. The video cut to a shot of Thomas's office. The camera zoomed in on his computer screen. It showed the very files he had just created, the evidence of Mia's embezzlement. But the screen showed something else. The timestamps. The files were being created now. The video showed a remote access cursor moving across the screen, dragging and dropping forged documents into Mia's folders. And the remote access ID displayed at the top of the screen was Thomas's own personal laptop, currently sitting in the trunk of his car. Mia hadn't just predicted his trap. She had filmed him setting it. She had turned his logical defense into the ultimate proof of his guilt. To everyone in the room, it looked like Thomas Miller was caught in the act of fabricating evidence to ruin a student who had rejected him. "Professor Miller." Arthur's voice broke the silence, sounding small and horrified. Thomas looked at Mia. She wasn't smiling anymore. She was crying. Perfectly, silently, she leaned into Robert Taylor's shoulder, the picture of a victim finally seeing the depth of her harasser's depravity. He told me he'd destroy me if I didn't love him. Mia sobbed, her voice amplified by the microphone she'd been wearing all evening. I didn't think he'd go this far. The world tilted. Thomas felt the floor beneath him turn to water. He had tried to be the smartest man in the room, and in doing so, he had handed Mia the rope to hang him. He was no longer just a disgraced professor. He was a criminal, a forger, and a monster, caught in the act by his own obsession with order. Security guards, men in dark suits with sentinel pins, began to move toward the tech booth. Thomas looked at Sarah. She was standing in the center of the ballroom, her face a mask of shattered glass. She looked at him as if he were a stranger, a ghost she no longer recognized. He had lost. Not just the argument, not just the job, but the very foundation of his life. And as the guard's hands closed around his arms, he heard Mia's voice, a soft whisper that seemed to come from the vents themselves. We told you, Thomas, you can't account for every variable. The chaos of the ballroom was a blur of crimson silk and golden light. Thomas felt the heavy, calloused hands of the security guards on his shoulders, a physical weight that finally grounded him in the reality of his ruin. He looked up at the podium, where Mia was being comforted by the most powerful men in the state. She looked down at him, and for a split second, The mask of the victim slipped. Her eyes were cold, bright, and utterly triumphant. He had one card left. It was a desperate, suicidal move, but it was the only thing that could stop the we. "Stop!" Thomas shouted, his voice cracking the silence of the room. He shoved the guards back with a strength born of pure, unadulterated panic. He scrambled toward the podium, tripping over a floral arrangement, 1, 2, before grabbing the microphone. "You want the truth?" Thomas screamed, looking directly into the camera lens that was still broadcasting his shame. "You want to know about the Miller legacy? Then let's talk about the money." Arthur Higgins stepped forward, his face purple with rage. "Thomas, that's enough. Get him out of here." "No!" Thomas yelled, his voice echoing like a gunshot. "Arthur, tell them about the special project funds. Tell them how we've been using the Excellence in Ethics Scholarship to cover the department's deficit for 5 years. I didn't forge those documents to frame Mia. I forged them to hide the fact that the money is already gone." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of a vacuum. Arthur froze. Robert Taylor, the head of the board, slowly turned to look at the dean. It was a lie, mostly. There was a deficit, and there had been some creative accounting. But Thomas was painting it as a massive, systematic fraud. He was confessing to a crime he hadn't committed to expose a truth they couldn't ignore. "I was the one who did it," Thomas lied, his eyes fixed on Mia. "And Mia found out. She wasn't my victim. She was my blackmailer. She wanted the scholarship as hush money. Isn't that right, Mia? Or should we ask the auditors to look at the consulting fees paid to your shell company in Delaware?" He saw the flicker of genuine fear in Mia's eyes. He had changed the game from a he said, she said drama to a financial investigation. A police audit would look at everything, every account, every email, every shadow. Mia's carefully constructed identity wouldn't survive that kind of light. She was a ghost, a creature of the margins, and ghosts vanish when the accountants arrive. "He's lying!" Mia shouted, her voice losing its breathy, hypnotic quality. "He's just trying to take us down with him." "Maybe," Thomas said, dropping the microphone. The feedback shrieked through the hall. "But either way, the police are coming, for all of us." He turned and walked off the stage, the guards too stunned to stop him. He found Sarah in the crowd. She was pale, her hand resting on her stomach in a gesture he hadn't understood until that very moment. "We have to go," Thomas whispered, grabbing her hand. "Now." They ran through the ballroom, past the crimson-clad donors and the frozen violinists. They burst through the heavy oak doors and into the cool Connecticut night. The parking lot was a sea of luxury cars, but Thomas found his SUV, the one with the cracked window and the smell of exhaust. He threw his leather briefcase into the back and shoved the key into the ignition. As he pulled out of the lot, he saw the blue and red lights of police cruisers turning into the university gates. "Thomas, what did you do?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I burned the house down, Sarah," he said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. It was the only way to get the wolf out of the kitchen. He drove through the night, the highway a lonely stretch of asphalt and dark trees. He didn't look back at the lights of the university. He didn't think about his tenure, his research, or his reputation. All of those things were ash now. He pulled over at a secluded overlook, the engine ticking as it cooled. Sarah was asleep in the passenger seat, her breathing shallow and rhythmic. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold wedding ring. He looked at it for a long time. The sapphire glinted in the moonlight, a small blue eye that had seen everything. He realized then that his obsession with logic, his need for every step to be counted, had been a cage of his own making. He had built a life so rigid that a single girl could shatter it just by moving an ottoman. He looked at Sarah's hand, resting on her lap. He slowly, gently, slid the ring back onto her finger. It fit perfectly. 14, he whispered, not as a count, but as a goodbye to the man he used to be. He reached into the back seat and pulled out his leather-bound university planner, the book that held his entire life, his schedules, his grades, his grid. He opened the door and walked to a nearby trash can. He pulled out a lighter and touched the flame to the corner of the first page. The paper curled and blackened, the elegant script of his academic life turning to smoke. He watched as the symbols of his tenure, the appointments, and the lecture notes were consumed by the flame. He felt a strange, terrifying sense of lightness. He was no longer a professor of ethics. He was just a man, standing on the side of a road, with nothing but a wife and a child he hadn't met yet. He returned to the car and sat behind the wheel. The sun was beginning to peek over the horizon, a thin line of gold that promised a new day, however uncertain. Sarah stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at him, then down at the ring on her finger. She didn't ask where they were going. She just reached over and took his hand. "Thomas?" "I'm here," he said. "I'm really here." He put the car in gear and drove toward the sunrise, leaving the New England autumn and the ruins of his fragile glass house behind. The American dream was gone, replaced by something much harder and much more real. And for the first time in 45 years, Thomas Miller didn't count the miles. He just drove.